let me just circle back around to facilities management and why there's this tie-in with ISO 288, the education management one. And it's this, so for the education facilities industry, there is this trend towards online learning. And the education management system standards has a lot to do with learning management systems, and so everyone but the United States is involved in development of this standard. And there is an eventual, and this is long-term thinking, but there is an eventual impact on facilities as it relates to online learning and the future of higher education campuses. Now, maybe the University of Michigan may not be as greatly impacted, but who knows? We don't know what the direction is headed in regarding online learning, but we do know that the technology is going to drive this, and students are going to drive this aspect of education, and they already are, throughout the world. It's just to what extent will the U.S. be part of that conversation, and to what extent will it actually impact campus infrastructure, oh, I'm sorry about that, and sustainability.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so I know that the facilities management standard, takes into account all sectors. Of course, we tend to focus in on the education facilities industry, but we also go wider afield sometimes in our conversations and in our writings, because we know that it has implications beyond just our industry.
Sure. Well, and I think it's very relevant in that what we see across the globe now in more private and corporate facilities, there's an explosion or a rapid evolution of the workplace to be more dynamic, more flexible, activity-based workspaces that is creating new requirements. And that's very different in, I think, traditional college campuses. But if that model changes in universities and college campuses, there may be, again, a different perspective on the use of space.
Right.
So I think it could be, again, that integration is very important, and understanding that strategic perspective is really valuable.
Right, and it is a lot to think about, and far-reaching perhaps at this moment in time. But if you're not part of the conversation in setting whatever standards are being developed, then you may or may not have a negative impact. You just don't know. We don't know what we don't know. So not being part of that particular conversation is concerning. It's terrific that IFMA is on board and the U.S. tag for this standard. So it's a good example. I think we can look to this as a good example. If anybody were to say to us, well, why, what's going on with this 288? And we say, well, or why should we be involved? I think we can look at ISO 267 and your involvement on it as an example of why you would want to be involved.
Yes. And I think one thing, we had this discussion last night, a few of us, and we were talking about there needs to be a common goal and globally. And the facilities industry is incredibly fragmented. So there is a common goal globally, whether people want to buy into it or not. Many do. And I think the standardization can really help in elevating the disciplines. We're in a position, and Mike touched on it earlier too, is we're not flush with cash. There's a need to better justify resources and funding to be better stewards of the built environment. And that's a global need. So I think, from both, a service perspective and hard perspective, there is that common goal globally that can bring us together for the FM standard.
Yes.
I have my hand. We actually bought a copy of the 18480-2. I see a lot of the diagrams that were in the Berlin meetings in here. So it's very when I look at this, and I think I'm in a developing country, I say this makes sense. This gives me a way forward to train my people and to allocate resources in a certain way where they don't have that. But when a person who has been in the business in the United States for 20 years, he looks at this and he'll say, okay, yeah, it gives me a vocabulary. It gives me a vocabulary, but I don't know how can I translate the time I spend on this into less hours for me, less hours for others. That's always a problem. It's not just the standards. A lot of the standards, especially a lot of the management standards. Technical standards, it's usually fairly easy to do. But we have to understand that the management standards really are underlying a lot of the resource allocation decisions. So whenever we feel that we get a little bit too how to say, up in the air or abstract. Very often, in fact, you can see me doing this today. I try to be very clear. We may be talking globally, but right now we've got a problem. We've got a problem is that this particular organization is making us test these eye washes every week, and they have to be at 70 degrees for 2 minutes. And I have about 10 million in my industry. Why do I have to test them every week? So this is an example where we try to work at a very high level, at the EU level and the United States level, but we always try to bring it down to specifics. So when you develop, if you were to go and approach an IFMA standard for strategic sourcing for the education facilities industry, you'd have to be rather specific. And I'm thinking of one example. And I would say that I'm not sure if I think I wrote it up in here in my statement to you. You're going to see here I made a statement that very often the way information technology is evolving, how do you account for the central IT department versus the IT department of different schools? So, for example, in the United States, at least in the University of Michigan. Every department, we have about 28 of them, has their own IT staff. And then there's a central staff that does certain things that the others can't do alone. So how do you account for that distinction in a balance sheet? How do you, and I talked to Paul over here, I told him that you needed to have a better way of describing the money that you're spending on facilities. Where's Paul? There's Paul right there. And this is what he wrote up about it. So you'll see that my recommendation was here when we met in Berlin. So I think that if an approach is maybe even a vocabulary for how you explain how much resources are being devoted to facilities, what part of the balance sheet, and of course when you ask that question, what goes on? What goes on? You're accounting for how do you account for central versus decentralized services, which actually leads me to a question: how does IFMA have a finance committee of some sort that would be able to answer a question? How much money in any sector of the U.S. economy is spent on facilities? Is banking? Paul said that banking was up to 40% was on facilities. I think we're about 15 to 20% in our industry. How about the manufacturing industry? How about facilities that are servicing the retail industry? How much is actually spent? Take a retail store, a gift shop. How much of their money is spent keeping their facility going with respect to their revenue? That was does IFMA have anything like that?
They do have portions of that. Now, it may be, again, they look at cost of operations, they do look at total cost of operations and total cost of ownership across various industries. What they haven't done yet is tie it to revenue or tie it to, it's basically all normalized by a square foot of facility. So, I think there are other ways of looking at it. The other issue is the quality of the data and the information is in my eyes, there's some concern because of the lack of standardization in the benchmarking process. It's a very complex issue when you start to look at how you track all those costs. And if I were to be critical as an engineer, I think there's been a lack of discipline in the facilities realm around that area. We certainly have some very smart business-minded individuals that get the financial aspects and budgeting and how to do that. But it's yet, even I spoke with Mike Feldman, who was the facility director for LAX Airport, and they had done some benchmarking studies looking at costs, looking at relative facilities costs, and you see, their revenue comes from airlines, it comes from concessions, multiple places. Their costs are very broad as well. And when I asked Mike about the results of their benchmarking survey, I think he had one of the best quotes I've ever heard. I use this time and time again, and he said, Jim, if you've seen one airport, you've seen one airport. Because they all track that information very differently, and it's extremely difficult to compare apples to apples when you look at that level of financial accounting.
Yeah.
And I think, again, this is, another kind of related area here. I think one of the things to me is, even in the development of standards, back to your question in terms of the value and how to save time and do some of these things, I think we've got a long way to go. But at least for me, it's establishing some high-level guidelines and create a framework that we can hang more best practice or guidance documents off of, to be able to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of how we do things. But it needs to be organized. Again, one of my biggest concerns, and it gets back to that knowledge management and strategy, is there's a lot of research out there. There's a lot of white papers, a lot of good things. But in many cases, I get so frustrated in that it's redundant. I see the same thing over and over and over. I see the same paper coming out of Austria, the Netherlands, Australia, and the U.S., and we don't have a knowledge framework to build off that into a really good research platform to continue to move it forward effectively. So again, my hope is that in coming together in the standardization process, we can do that a little bit better and really start to build on it more like other professions, engineering, but even more so, the legal, the medical professions, and creating neural networks that you can really develop good continued research and not just anecdotal things. There are too many holes.
Mm-hmm. Christine?
No, I think that's really terrific. I think that I was just, when you mentioned the medical, I was recalling your article and how you mentioned the DNA, that standards are the DNA, and that in any particular sector, we need those, for lack of a better word, standards, best practices, and it's a lot of work to get to that place. And sometimes people involved in the particular industries or sectors may not understand the value of this process. And I'm of course speaking of our own. And yet, when you look at the final outcome and the framework that then is created, then you see the benefit of it. So there is some history that shows that this is well worth the effort. But in the midst of the effort, it is kind of an arduous process. So I think establishing the necessity is really a great way to begin the conversation, and then the real work that has to happen on all the committees and whatnot. Sometimes we think that there's just a lot of talk and no action, just a lot of talking, not doing. And yet when you see the final outcome and what the impact can be in giving that framework, then you realize that's where the doing happens after the actual, process of standards development occurred. So hopefully the United States is not left behind in that. It certainly won't be with the work that you're doing on facilities management. but there are other sectors that need this as well, or need to be part of it as well.
I agree. Well, that's well said. That was exactly what I was trying to say. Yeah, I think routinely I was just at the University of Connecticut this week and I've been working with BC and dozens more right now. And again, I think one of the big opportunities for me as a consultant and advisor, and unfortunately for the industry, is we don't look at really good outcomes-based performance measurement. And I think we're so far behind in that, in telling the FM story and justifying resources and looking at capital, making better decisions. And what I find is it's due to many things, but one of the big ones is a complete lack of standardization. The other thing is inconsistent processes. Even within a university, facilities organizations, the processes are so inconsistent that the measures, the outcomes, you can't even relate. So, it's a, I get kind of passionate about it, but it's one of those things that it's kind of like I feel you have to kind of get back to the beginning and develop these standards in the framework to then really get into those details. If you can't measure it, there's no way you can improve. And right now, I think we're behind the curve in being able to measure performance in any reliable, credible, consistent, repeatable fashion.
Well, we have one measure. It's the cost of the education. And we know the industry that's least involved in standards, the one who actually lives and dies by standards. There's such a thing as first grade. There's such a thing as 12th grade. There's such a thing as a baccalaureate degree. All that stuff is based on standards, but as far as actually running the enterprise of it, no. Everyone's going off in their different directions. And I think a lot of that is just in the nature of the people who are actually part of it. Well, we are running onto an hour here, and I think we're going to be hitting the limit of our JPEG here, of our WMV file. It might be that we have to cut this in half, and maybe we don't want to post it at all, but at least we have it for our record. I wanted to know what we could do. My agenda is to try to get is to look into the specifics of how your organization could help us work with the specifics. So I pulled this one up here, and even though I know we're dealing with management standards right now, is this something? I'm sure that some of your members have to deal with this particular type of safety technology. And one of the things we deal with is that we have this burden. Our operations and maintenance budget says that you shall do these things, and if you don't do these things, you risk what I call enforcement by litigation. Nobody can afford to conform to all the codes and standards, so they just take their chances. This is what a facility manager does, because he can only conform to less than half of all the standards he's obligated to. So basically, a day at the work is very often like a day at the track. So are there people that in your membership that could supply data for us to say, how often are these things failing? Are these things failing once a week? We don't think so. But we know why, that in the first draft of the standard, the people who could afford to get to the meeting wrote themselves a revenue stream. Now, I'm sure there are exceptions, but this is the specific example. Whenever I get too far into policy areas, I bring it right back down to a very specific need that we have. And we know that if we can relax this testing interval to biweekly or even monthly in some cases, that I've saved about $100,000 per year. And that's meaningful. That's meaningful avoided cost. So I'll get to my question. Is there anyone in the IFMA membership who could help us put together a data set? And I'm sure that IFMA members may well be interested, because if you are managing colleges and universities and laboratories and research areas, even housing areas, the chemicals that the chemicals that the janitors are using require eye washes. These things are taking over the world. So that's my specific question. And I'll let if you can answer that one, Jim.
Yes. At a couple of the bottom line is yes. There are members that have that data, that can provide that data information from an operations and maintenance perspective. The challenge is, I think, and it's helpful now, we're restructuring IFMA councils in communities, which has been a little bit confusing. But again, we have vertical market kind of industry councils around airports, around and academic, around higher education, public sector, utilities, etc. We're now restructuring to have communities around knowledge areas of operations and maintenance, around workplace, around environmental health and safety, technology. This restructuring, combined with looking at the knowledge strategy, I think is going to, my hope is it's going to create a greater value proposition for the members to get engaged at a level that you're talking about, that I don't think has happened before. And I think that structure may allow, again, it's driving a need for those individuals to come together to talk about whether it's technology, and this would be perfect in an operations and maintenance aspect in that community, because IFMA members in the past have only been involved in advocacy at a different level, a higher level. They haven't, through IFMA, they may have through ASHRAE or through NFPA or others, been engaged in this kind of advocacy. But this is something I think would be incredibly valuable for me personally, to many IFMA members at that level. There's some higher executive levels that would drive that down, but I think it would be. And I think there will be a better opportunity going through that community to be able to get access and get that kind of information and share that information between IFMA members and you.
Mm-hmm. Well, then there's some hope possibly. So I'll give you another example. You probably use steel in some of your buildings. I bet you many of your members use steel in their buildings. Is that a fair guess?
Fair guess.
Okay.
Steel and concrete.
Okay.
It's hard to get away from.
Yeah, this is one of my. So this is another specific example. If we could reach out somehow to the IFMA membership, or you could point out our website. Now, I think I'm waiting for the server to come up, but pretty much every day a new red line or a new strike and bold document is put out there for public review. And very often you'll find subject matter experts that get close to this. We have found that there's a tendency to over-design, especially among the structural engineers. I think these guys take their cues from the old Holy Roman Empire and from some of the inspiration of ancient Greece. It sure is taking a long time. Well, long story short, we have a rather long red line here, but we don't have anybody. Oops, looks like it is coming up now. So this is the raw document. This is where your costs are determined, right here. See all this red stuff here? This tells you, now some of it's correlation, I get that, but this is how the rules of the road are written. The stuff that we do here today will affect us 6 to 12 years, just as what we're paying for today is owed to what was decisions that were made 6 to 12 years ago. So I'd like to be able to become visible to some of IFMA's members, so that they can, and as you see every day here, we, in fact, twice, sometimes 3 times a day, we pull out what I call a commentable opportunity. We have groups that sort of form. So here's healthcare facilities, and we marked up some proposals having to do with electrical use, and how many power receptacles do you need in a certain area of the hospital. Often we deal with air compartmentalization, but every day we have a commenting opportunity, and our discipline, while we're guided by the larger policy issues that we deal with over here, because we know that there's a certain class of people that don't want to get themselves dirty. So we try to service them, and we put them in front of, CEOs want to talk to other CEOs. So we'll post something there. This is ANSY's CEO. So we give a little bit of red meat to the people who don't want to get themselves dirty, but then we give a little red meat to people who actually want to do stuff. And here's another group here that this group here claims that they can reduce the cost of lead certification. They have their own type of certification. Lead has made so much money that it's drawn competitors. That's what happens in America. And so now
Right.
they have their own green building assessment. This is a public comment draft, and this will be the template for enforcement money to flow. Remember, there's more money to be made in enforcement. That's something IFMA should consider, actually. There's more money to be made in enforcement than actually writing the standard. Your standard's a seed cord for your enforcement revenue. So I like to become visible somehow to IFMA. We keep we try to distill. We're not too busy about things. This whole smart cities thing, it might be of interest to you. It's still kind of up in the air. At the electrical level, we're doing very specific things, but the specific things we're doing is beyond the technical capability of the policy folks who take all the travel money away from us. So long story short, if you could make us visible, we could make to your membership. And remember, I'm not a membership organization like APA and IFMA and others. I don't have the obligation to fill conference rooms. I'm actually able to get to the specifics of things, and that's where we'd like some input from IFMA members. And if there's any favor, if we could do an article, we'll post your article. Okay, all right.
Yeah, that's the FMJ online version. Yeah, okay. Well, this is I'd love to follow up in another call about this, because I think there's one of the things I've been working very hard on with the IFMA board is, of all the strategic initiatives they have going on, it's important for me to get an integration around advocacy standards, the education and knowledge strategy. And I think, again, tying in the councils, the O&M community, healthcare council, et cetera, with the knowledge strategy, there may be a great opportunity to link and share some things with you. And I'd love to explore that further in detail in a separate call. I have a call at 11:15 with somebody from UK, so I'm expecting them to Skype me any second. But I think it would be great to follow up on that topic.
Yeah, I have an 11:30 myself with IEEE. Christine, could you work the calendars? Maybe meet sometime next month.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And also, Jim, we'll if you can't be here in Ann Arbor in May, we could possibly have you call in at some point in the meeting, whatever's convenient for your schedule, just to have you be a part of it at some level.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take a look at my schedule and see what's going on, and I'll find out. That was around, I think it was like, May 10 or so, 10, 11, something like that?
Yeah. Yep. You can go to ANSY's website and get the info. You can go to our website and get the info. May 10th and 11th, we're hosting it on the campus at the Ross School of Business.
Okay.
And
Great.
so we'll have all the technology if you want to call in.
Excellent. I'll see what I can do. I know I'm headed to Orlando and New Zealand right around there, but one may be shifted a little bit. So let me take a look at that, and we'll follow up on that. That'd be great.